So he says, look, if the first fruit was holy by faith, the lump is holy. Now, in the second part with Israel, who's the root of Israel? It's Abraham. Right? So if Abraham is holy, then the branches are holy also. So he's giving this example, and what's the example in answer to? Did they stumble so they might fall forever? So he's just saying, hey, look, Israel started off in holiness, separated to God and Abraham. And now we know, this is evidence, that they are not fallen forever, that they have not fell, that they would stay fallen. Does that make sense? That's this whole argument that he's putting forward here, that God is not done with Israel. He's working all these things together for good. Verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. So now he already told us, who is he speaking to? Gentiles. Every Gentile. And he's saying, you as a Gentile, you were, so he's continuing this example of a tree. You have the roots, you have a stalk, and you have branches. And he says, look, if you were grafted in, you were a wild olive shoot. All of you guys, just wild olive shoots, right? And he says, if you were a wild, he was doing this thing. So there's a natural olive shoot or olive tree, which is Israel, from Abraham. So it's something he's building. So he says, look, there was something that God was doing inherently. Now, Gentiles could always be part of that, right? This is why you have to be so careful with absolutes. Gentiles could always be part of what God was doing. They always could. They were only, in a sense, purged, which is a very polite way of saying genocided, basically. There was only that radical judgment that came upon Gentiles when, as a people, they completely rejected and went off into really bizarre sexual and violent sin, right? And then there was punishment for that. And there was punishment for that for Israel too. But he has this tree that he's building. Gentiles were always welcome to be a part of it. So we can't just be like, oh, it wasn't yeah. Be careful. It's not absolutes. But in this case, he's saying, you, in 56 AD, who he's talking to, you as wild olive shoots are grafted in. So we adopt that because we go, that's who we are. But he says, and here's the warning because it's what Israel did. He says, don't be arrogant and realize that you were grafted in. And not to look at the other branches, like Israel or even other Gentiles, and become pompous about them and go, I'm really special. I was grafted in. God wanted me on his team. Sorry about your luck. However it might be. He says, don't become arrogant. That's what happened to Israel. Remember we talked about that. God called them to be a light to the nations. They became introverted. They suffered at the hands of the nations, and then they rejected the nations. And they missed out on what God had called them to do because they became arrogant based on how they were treated. They weren't forgiving. They weren't obedient to God. They walked in unbelief. And this had this radical snowball effect all the way into where they're at today and where they were at in 56 AD when Romans gets cranked out and in all these different time periods. That's what's going on. But I apologize for the repetition, but God works all things together for good. So he's using the whole thing, right? So he says, hey, you wild olive branch, he says, do not get arrogant. And remember that the root, the promises to Abraham, and ultimately would be Jesus, the root nourishes you. That's his warning. You don't nourish the root. The root doesn't depend on you. You depend on the root, he says. He says, remember that you were grafted in. Don't get arrogant, but remember that everything that you have, literally translates the fatness of the olive root. He says, remember, that's been given to you, but don't get arrogant and think that you deserve it or you earned it or anything else. Verse 19, now he's going to address something that a Gentile might say. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. So when Paul's presenting this argument, he says, hey, you were grafted in, don't get arrogant against the other branches. And then he says, but you might say, you Gentile might say back to me, well, hey, branches were broken off so I could get in. God broke those people off so that I could be in. But he's going to address that. In verse 20, he says, that is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, and you stand fast through faith. So don't become proud, but fear. So he says, you're half right. He says, it's true. They were broken off. But they weren't broken off for any other reason than this. They didn't believe. So the idea that somehow and it's weird how we can kind of think these things, but again, I think a lot of times what we do is we can forget about so much stuff that we've read and so much stuff that we know, and we get caught in just this weird analogy. And if we don't read contextually, we can really come to a place where we think, yeah, I mean, God had to break a bunch of people. Like there was some sort of limited amount of people that could come into heaven. There is a church that, I wouldn't call it a church, there is a group of people that teach that. There will be 144,000 to make to heaven, and they come by their door, and they hand you the watchtower. And I'm thinking to myself, there's only 144,000. I'm like keeping my watchtower, and I'm sorry for you guys. But that's what happens. And we can get that same teaching. We go, well, clearly people had to be broke off so I could get in. No, he says, you're right, but they were only broken off because of their unbelief. In other words, Gentiles could always be saved. They could always come to Jehovah. It's not that all of a sudden in the New Testament there was like too many, and so God was like, well, I'm going to break some Jews off and throw them away, and then I'm going to stick some Gentiles in there, and you better be nice to me, because if you're not, I'll break you off and throw you away, and I'll get the other ones and I'll stick them back in. Right? But how many times have you heard that teaching? And this is one of the things we talk all the time in our Bible communication class. This is one of the ultimate shrug passages. Meaning someone reads it, they don't keep it in context, they mean well, we're not judging people's hearts. But then they go, well, I don't know. I just know you don't want to get broke off. And you leave the church going, I don't want to get broke off either. But I don't really understand this. Because I thought I was saved by grace through faith. But now evidently if I get arrogant, I'm going to get broke off. I don't know what to do, right? And it's weird because it generates a lack of faith. It generates anxiety. It generates fear, not healthy fear. This kind of fear of like an abused kid. Like you're going to get the stick when you didn't deserve it. Like at any time, you just be, arrogant. And we completely disregard the Ephesians chapter 2. You've been saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. We completely disregard that we may boldly say, the Lord is our helper. He'll never leave us or forsake us. All of a sudden, all those promises that go right out the window, and we're like, we're going to get broke off. So we have to look at it in context. What is he saying? He's just saying, look, God used this thing in this time in 56 AD. And he's going to continue to work, and we'll read more. He's going to continue to work into the Gentiles until he's done. And then he will continue to work with the Jews. But for now, you wild olive branches, be careful that you don't look at the fact that God in general, because Jews are still getting saved, is working among the Gentiles and think to yourself, I'm really special, and God broke those other fools off so he could have me. He says, no, don't think that. They were only broken off because of unbelief. And then he says to Gentiles, you'll get broken off too. Not to individuals. He is not saying, obviously Gentiles are made of individuals, but he is not saying to the believer, if you get arrogant in your little branch, I'm breaking you off. We're always arrogant. I mean, let's be honest. We really love ourselves. Has there ever been a day that's passed where at some point during the day we didn't have some sort of thought about how great we are? Even if it just came in some sort of judgment of how terrible someone else was? If someone else is terrible, what does that make us? Better. Right? That's why whenever you're witnessing to someone, they always say the same thing. I'm a good person. I've never killed anyone. You're like, I feel like there's a lower bar for a good person. Like, I feel like everybody's a good person. Like pretty much like 99.9% of the population are good people because they haven't killed someone. But that's how we compare it. We never say, I'm a good person because I've never screamed at someone, because almost none of us can say that. Right? So it's important to realize he's speaking generally of things that are going on.